Hey, it's Matt from Black Coal Woodworking. Welcome here. A family member brought me some black ash that had been growing in their yard, and they had some fond memories tied to that home and, by extension, the tree. So, what we're going to do is turn some of these pieces of wood into snack bowls. This is what the wood looks like. So, my plan is to turn some of them into once turned bowls, which is really just that. You literally turn them one time on the lathe and then finish them and they're done. Some of them I'm going to do twice turned, which means I'll rough them out on the lathe the first time, leave them thick and let them dry, and then I'll turn them a second time and finish them then. The difference between the two types of turning is that the once turned bowls might actually warp a bit.
So I didn't show it, but I cut this in half with a chainsaw first. And then over at the bandsaw, I cut a slice off just to see where the cracks are so I can get past them and get back into solid wood. And then cut the corners off so I can turn this a little bit easier. I prefer to mark out where center is whenever I can. Sometimes you have to eyeball it, but in this case, at least I can mark it because I actually want to use the screw chuck to mount this to the lathe. That gives me the option of turning the full outside of the bowl first without having to rechuck and figure out other methods. I used my skew chisel to take off the loose bark. That way there's less flying at me if it does come off. I'm using my 1/2-inch spindle gouge. I start to rough out the outside of the bowl. I line the bevel up with the cut I want to make, and with the left wing of the tool, take off the wood. You can see I can get roughly about 1/2 inch of wood taken out at a time. Since I did not cut this fully round on the bandsaw, there's quite a bit to remove before I get past all that bark. And you'll see me stop a few times to check to see where I am, because I really want to keep as much of the wood as I can, and when it's spinning like it is, you can't really see what you've got left until you stop the piece. The bark on this type of wood seems to have two particular layers. There's that really rough outer bark that's really obvious. Then there's a really light bark that's somewhat discolored. You can see the lines surrounding that rough bark. That needs to come off too, because if I don't take it off, it's going to come off at some other point when I don't want it to, most likely when the new owner of this bowl is using it. Next, I marked out where I wanted the recess of this bowl, and then using the 1/2-inch spindle gouge, flatten that spot just so I can get into it a little bit easier with my parting tool. With the parting tool, I make roughly 2 cuts wide, and then try and get it as deep as I think I'll need it. This is sort of a roughed out process. I'll need to refine it further later. Nonetheless, after I've got most of the waste removed there, I'll use my flat scraper to try and give it a half-decent bottom. Also gave it a bit of a foot to rest on there. Back to the 1/2-inch spindle gouge, I finished cleaning up the outside of the bowl, just so that it's finally at its final shape beyond any kind of cleanup I do with, once again, the flat scraper. This really takes away any of that nicks and things that I didn't want, and does give it a bit of a nicer shape as it's a little more smooth and I don't have to do as much sanding that way. I'm really trying to touch the wood as little as possible and let the burr do all the cutting, which will give it the best cut I can possibly get out of that tool. And as I said before, I did have to refine that foot just a bit, make it a little deeper for the jaws. This is my smallest spindle gouge, and I'm just using it to make that inside of that recess dovetailed slightly to make it sit in the jaws better. Switching over to the inside of the bowl, I'm using a 1/2 inch bowl gouge. First step is to really flatten the outside so that it's a little more even when I start to dig into the bowl itself. Even though this bowl is small, it created a lot of shavings, and it's the nice fluffy kind. They're the ones that are a lot of fun to cut. If I were to do a twice turn bowl, knocking off those corners and the way you see the bowl now is where I would stop. And I would let this thing sit somewhere and let it dry for a while. But since these are for someone for Mother's Day, that means these are going to be the once turned. So on I go. When I make a once turn bowl, I'm just going to make it thinner. So that's the goal, a thin but strong bowl. And you'll see me check the thickness there. I need to make sure it's parallel. And then the best way for me to make it parallel is by sticking my bowl gouge right up against the side using the left wing of the tool. It's really kind of resting against the bowl, and it creates a very, very clean cut that way. It's a nice way to finish it off before I have to get to sanding again. And you'll see every time I do that, like right here, you get really wispy, tiny little shavings. Those are the really nice kind. If you see those, you know that it's going to be a good cut. I needed to make the last few passes like that with that shear cut where I get those nice shavings. Now I'm kind of in a bit of a crunch time here because this wood is fairly wet. I need to keep going quickly, otherwise it's going to start to warp before I'm done. What you're seeing now is me use my round nose scraper, and just on the side there I can get a nice shaving also. These are just some of the steps I take to make sure the sanding process is as short as possible. Here I'm using that round nose scraper to adjust the thickness of the inside of the bowl ever so slightly. I find that it's a much easier way for me to do that. The bowl gouge works as well, but that scraper just gives me a little bit more flexibility. And I get that really clean cut so that when I'm done that, I can just move on to the next part of the inside or move on to sanding. The bottom of the bowl, especially, I need to use a scraper on. If I try with a bowl gouge, it's just almost impossible to get a good cut because I don't have a bottom bowl gouge. That means my bevel on my gouge is too long, essentially. After refining that bottom just a little bit with the scraper, I moved on to the finishing. In this case, I'm finishing it with a food safe finish, which is walnut oil. I find that it's a simple finish that the people who are going to be using these bowls will be able to reapply whenever they want to, and it's really simple. Anyone can do it. It doesn't take a lot of extra skill. You don't need a lathe to sort of friction polish anything in. And this type of wood actually takes this type of finish extremely well. I think it looks gorgeous. In fact, here are some more pictures to show what I think. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Consider subscribing if I've earned it. Give it a thumbs up and throw me a comment. See you next time.